right.
Okay.
We're live.
We are so
in front of
live.
a studio audience in Breda, the Netherlands. This is the Ember Sword Podcast.
We are gonna have bombastic music. I'm gonna download free firework noises. It's going to be the bomb. So yeah, hi everybody. This is a fun experiment we're doing here with the team. I'm Svetlin. I will be your humble host going forward with these. I am in charge of a decent amount of the marketing activities for Ember Sword, and the team and I sat down and we thought, hey, let's give people more of what they want. So you guys wanted more information, and this is our way of trying to give it to you. So this is the first iteration of our podcast. The topic is going to be split into 3 parts. This specific series is going to be on AI direction. We're talking what it is, where it came from. There's multiple layers to this, so that's why we're splitting into, different parts for your viewing pleasure and convenience. Listening, sorry. Since I'm a marketing man, I know next to nothing about nothing, so thankfully I have friends who know everything about everything. With that, I would like to introduce Loren, our executive producer, who is going to be telling you about the AI direction. Specifically, we're going to be starting with cinematic combat. Loren, welcome.
Thank you, Svetlin. It's great to be here, and indeed, let's talk about AI direction and, of course, cinematic combat in specific. So, AI direction is actually a really big sort of tenet for Ember Sword. It's one of our sort of 3 main lines of unique features that we're building. And it really has just one purpose. If you think about your typical MMO experience, at least to me, certainly, an MMO is typically a game of like some really awesome peak experiences. And then in between that, there is a lot of meh, It's a lot of walking around, a lot of grinding, a lot of kind of, just murdering creatures one by one, and bringing back their horns, teeth, or other body parts to
Rat
some
pelts.
strange to some guy with a very unhealthy obsession in order to progress through the storyline, right?
Animal skin enthusiasts, beware.
Indeed, and we just wanted to do something different there. So what that came down to is like this notion of what if we actually had sort of an AI director or an AI game master, if you will, that would make much more of the game interesting for you. Not just that epic raid that you do with your friends somewhere with end game content, but also can we not just make all of the experiences you're having, starting from like basic old combat while you're leveling up your character, all the way through to epic adventures? Can we not ensure that there is much more crunch to that is much more fun? And this is kind of where our notion of AI direction, our AI game master, came from.
Okay, so you mentioned where it came from. What does it actually entail? Get it down into the nitty-gritty. Why cinematic?
Okay, yeah. So one of the aspects that we're doing through our AI Game Master is creating a cinematic combat experience. So that's sort of like layer 1, and frankly, that's probably enough to cover in this podcast. And in the next ones, in the next parts, we'll definitely dive into more. But cinematic combat really only comes down to sort of what goes on your screen, right? Okay. So when you're running into a group of enemies, how do they behave, right? And again, you'll have seen a lot of games where how they behave is if you aggro them, they walk at you and they attack you until they are killed. Now, we had a little bit higher of a standard and did not want to build an MMO like that. So in the back, we've built a lot of technology that actually allows us to handle massive amounts of creatures in real time, all engaging with you. So actually our combat, although we are an MMO, is much more like, let's say, an action RPG. which allows us to do some truly epic stuff. So what we're doing when it comes to cinematic combat is we're kind of taking the creature AI and building over top of that some sort of global AI game master layer that makes very interesting things happen during combat. And now that, I know may sound a little vague, so maybe taking it to an example, that means that you could be like, we have this little critters called Bormies, of which sometimes they're going to be 20, 30 attacking you, right? Because we're totally okay with handling that type of number, and they become very interesting because they have this notion of fear. So as you turn towards them with your sword, they will actually back off, and they might just snap at you a little, but they are maybe too afraid, to get into your direct range. As you start slaying them, there's actually a sort of fear buildup that's managed by this Game Master AI, which may make the others run away as they see their buddies being crushed. And these kind of things yield a very interesting combat experience. So I think probably the best example when we're talking like cinematic moments, which is kind of what we're trying to create with like this AI and cinematic combat, is, for example, we have an attack called Earth Shatter, which is something you can use if you have a pretty decent sword, right? You raise your sword over your head, you jam it into the ground, and then basically in front of you, you kind of see these cracks in the earth, moving forwards. And, as they move forward, this energy radiates out from them, damaging everything in its path. And that's quite an attack that has quite a wind-up and takes quite some time to move outwards from the player all the way to its maximum range. So, a typical movie moment here would be if you had a whole bunch of these Bormies rushing at you and you trigger this ability, they'll notice that you're starting this attack, and immediately in the area that's going to be affected, something we call a threat zone is being created. And that threat zone will cause these creatures to run away. But, just, running out of that threat zone efficiently would not be very amusing, right? Because, then if you do a slow ability, everyone would just get away, which, is something we want to avoid. You shouldn't have to, stun 20 individual Bormies in order to catch them in a really powerful ability.
Yeah, that sort of deflates the epicness of the moment, doesn't it?
Indeed. So what happens is actually... we've made sure that all of our creatures have studied what we would like to call the Prometheus school of running away from things.
Ah, yes.
So those of you that are not familiar with this term, it's a joke from CinemaSins. They do the everything wrong with videos. And there was this epic scene in Prometheus, of course, where something huge was sort of coming down on our heroes, and they were, running away, but very stupidly, they were running away in a straight line, exactly parallel to where this thing was falling, right? So we like to call this the Prometheus school of running away from things, and it's one of those classic movie moments where, you trigger an epic ability, enemies turn tail and run away, but they're just not fast enough to outrun the explosion that's following them. And thus, they get thrown up in the air and basically killed, right? And that yields some really unique, amazing combat. So that is kind of, the notion of like this sort of micro level of AI direction, I would call it, which results in our cinematic combat.
Well, for legal purposes, I would like to mention that we have not, in fact, hired Charlize Theron to be destroyed in our video game. That would be a humongous waste of her massive talent. Kind of like in Ridley Scott's magnum opus Prometheus, out now on Blu-ray.
All right, well, now that we've finished promoting that one, maybe there's a couple of cool things to move on to. It's actually an interesting thing, like this notion of fear fields and threat zones and things like that, right? Is not something that we've seen a lot in video games. Actually, there's like an interesting little tidbit there, in case you're wondering where this comes from. Like, literally the first implementation of these threat fields was something that I created for a real-time strategy game that was just like a hobby project, so it never got released. I think
Really?
over 15 years ago.
Huh.
And it was from the simple notion that, in all these epic, like, World War II movies and such, whenever planes come strafing in, right, obviously you'd see people hit the deck and run to the sides and, everything. And, you play a game like, let's say, Red Alert, right? And, a yak comes in and strafes, and it just strafes everything down. No one's running away, no one is scattering, and I just thought that made no sense whatsoever. And it's actually there where sort of this movement started. And, since then, I've still not seen many games create something like that.
It doesn't necessarily happen often, yeah, and I've never really thought about it. A decent example I can give of this, I mean, to make this more relatable, I guess. You mentioned the AI direction. When we talked about this off mic like a while ago, when you were introducing me to the concept, a very apt comparison to the overall AI direction that I came up with was Left 4 Dead, where the director constantly is trying to ensure that you are having a good time by constantly throwing almost insurmountable challenges directly in your face. Right?
Yeah. No, that's definitely true. In fact, that's something that, probably in the second part of this podcast we'll spend a fair amount of time on.
Right.
Because indeed Left 4 Dead is also a precursor, of sort of the AI that we're building. But that actually operates on a slightly different level, right? Left 4 Dead is not really manipulating what's going on your screen in the combat at that moment. It's not making the zombie do something particularly interesting in response to what you did, right? But rather it works on another layer, which we'll definitely get to in the next podcast, where
just to whet the appetite of the folk.
Yeah, well, but that's a whole other story to get altogether, of course, which is where we're actually deciding what kind of things happen outside of the player screen. But it's very interesting that that note, but we'll leave that on a cliffhanger for now, I would guess. But yeah, so that is kind of a quick tour of what we're doing there. But obviously that's leaving a lot of core elements out. So maybe just for fun, we'll walk through sort of like the kind of core tenets of the micro level of this AI, which is actually these threat fields, and this notion of fear is actually only one of them, because we've got two more. We have the notion of courage and loyalty, and we also have this notion of throwing and knockbacks, both of which are really interesting. So on like the courage and loyalty portion of things, basically what that comes down to is as you may imagine, like a lone wolf is not particularly likely to attack you, right, out in the wild. But if it's a pack, they'll feel strengthened, and maybe they're hungry, and they'll go at it, right? And so we recreated this by having sort of a courage system in the game. So actually, what can happen, and this is I think we'll share a little DevByte video of this soon. Of some of the prototypes we have running this, but it's super interesting. Basically what happens is you might spot like a wolf or a couple of bormies and be like, yeah, I got them, and run after them, and they will run away, right? But then if they run in suddenly into a pack of like 15 other bormies, you might very quickly see them turn around and suddenly pounce on you. That is to do with sort of group courage. That's one thing. And the secondary part, it's sort of this notion of loyalty kind of comes with that too. So, for example, with wolves, we have regular wolves, but there's also an alpha wolf, right? And so the alpha wolf will typically, howl and call together other wolves that are on your screen, getting ready to fight you. And they will actually flank that alpha wolf and be much more courageous together. But, the trade-off is if you kill the alpha, the other wolves will likely scatter for a while, because their leader got killed, and that through loyalty has a very negative effect on their courage. So that's also something really interesting we're doing in this arena.
Hell yeah! Oh man, is there anything else you want to touch upon when it comes to the cinematic combat?
Well, I guess sort of the final point is our notion of throwing and knockbacks.
Right?
This is also something that is like very atypical for like MMO games, right? Like, I
Sure.
mean, when was the last MMO that you played where you as a player get like chucked into a wall by some massive enemy?
Oh, wow. I have a bad answer for this, but I'm going to refrain from showing my anime knowledge. But I immediately thought of Sword Art Online, but that is neither here nor there, and that is the worst anime of all time.
Well, yeah.
Disregard that. Please tell me about throws and knockbacks.
Okay, so now that we've scared off anyone who ever liked Sword Art Online, I think at least it points out one thing is we're not doing it in MMOs. The best we've had is like trying to, you know, pretend, wouldn't this be cool if it actually happened in an MMO? We can do it in our anime series. Um, but yeah, we feel that should obviously be part of the game. Those kinds of interactions, for it not to feel like that typical, kind of static combat, I slash you, you slash me, I time an ability, right? And so when it comes to enemies, we typically tend to have sort of roughly three types, if you will. We have these little enemies, which we like to jokingly refer to as ankle biters, who are typically, your swarming creatures, kind of fraidy cats, not immediately going to hop on and engage the player. Then you've got sort of your mid-size class enemies, which might be wolves or such, right? That are a little bit more capable on their own. And then we've got these sort of big bruiser type enemies that really don't get scared off very quickly at all, and are plenty happy to kind of take the player mano a mano, without being overcome by fear or anything. And in fact, these creatures are typically the creatures that bring like the big punchy throwing and knockback attacks. So for example, we've got some of these gruffs, that are really large. I mean, you're talking like, something that is 3 times taller than the player pretty much, right?
Yikes.
And they will kind of charge up a rush ability and literally just head first charge at the player and like maybe try to smack him with a giant club or something, right? And this is also something that we're doing, when it comes to combat, and that ties into sort of all of these systems. So when he does that charge, right? He doesn't care about these little Bormies that are like running around in front of him. He's just, blind rage. I'm gonna crush that player, right? So the first thing that happens is like, this threat zone gets created right in front of him where all these Bormies are standing, and they're now, instead of running away from the player's attack, they're just, trying to get out of the way of this oncoming locomotive of an enemy that is literally going to just end up throwing like 15 of them up in the air and maybe killing a bunch of them or having them land dazed somewhere else in the combat area before making his way to the player. And we've really got some like impactful capabilities that when you're not particularly ready to, let's say, receive that incoming attack, so it becomes more of a like action RPG timing thing, you are going to be thrown way back. You'll find yourself with your ass on the floor and getting back up from that hit. And yet at the same time, obviously, we've got some really cool abilities like Bolster that, when timed correctly, empower your shield to stop such an incredibly powerful rush and actually deal sort of a feedback damage to not only the enemy rushing you, but everything in like the immediate vicinity.
An active parry system, huh? Cool.
Yeah, it's actually part of sort of our ability. So depending on what kind of gear you're wearing, you may or may not have that ability available. But typically, if you're carrying a shield, right, then this kind of sort of active capability is there. But it's also very interesting how we kind of balance that out. That would be like a topic for a whole other story. But like for example, we do balance that out by having, for example, shared shield cooldowns. So if you have two abilities based on your shield, and one of them is throwing your shield to take out like a wide berth of light enemies, and the other is bolster, then you'd better hope you don't like go, oh, I'm gonna like do a nice little shield throw, and then 2 seconds later some giant enemy comes rushing at you. You're not gonna have your bolster ready, and you're gonna be sent flying.
Right. So it's very consequence heavy, I guess. Because every time I've been thrown in a video game, it just feels weirdly frustrating in a way. So I was about to ask how that is mitigated.
Yeah, exactly. Now, obviously, we're not gonna throw you unless you messed up in some way.
Yeah, so not every power attack is going to be, chuck you at the wall, splatter you like a bug.
No. It's like a sort of a hard punish, but also like a big reward, right? So you'll have an ability to counter this, and if you counter it, the reward is huge. But if you fail to counter it, it's a pretty hard punish, and this makes the game particularly interesting. But yeah, basically this is how our AI Game Master, through things like these threat zones that are positioned, through triggering like alpha wolves to call other creatures to their aid, and through even selecting cinematic ways for things to be thrown. Because I didn't quite mention this, but when you get thrown, normally in a game, it's kind of like okay, you just go in roughly that direction. And here, actually, both enemy creatures and players that get thrown, we try to particularly have our AI pick interesting places for them to get thrown into, right?
Uh-huh.
So if there is like a arena wall right behind you, we might choose to like smack dab throw you like back first into the arena wall in a almost cartoonesque manner.
Leave a hole.
yeah, Roadrunner type stuff. Anyway, but I think that kind of brings home the point of what we're trying to do with this. So we're trying to create combat in an MMO that is like something you'll have never experienced on screen in an MMO before, and this is how we're doing it.
That's very succinctly put. Well, I guess this wraps up this portion, or this part of our series in AI direction. Thank you for listening, and we'll catch you in the next one. Hey you made it to the end. Congratulations! That must mean you like us enough to want more, right? Well, good news! We're all over the internet. Go to embersword.com and subscribe to our newsletter for a chance to play the game early, as well as the latest interesting tidbits on the game and the team. Join our lovely Discord community over at discord.gg/embersword. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook at PlayEmberSword for regular updates on what we're up to. And remember the basics. Drink water, be kind to each other, and spread the word about Ember Sword.